What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy. Welcome back to our Bible study. Alrighty, so Leviticus 27. This is the last chapter in the book of Leviticus. So let's see the last bit of what this has in store for us. It's mostly been rules and stuff and regulations. Last chapter gave us a look at what God said would happen to his people if they followed him, but then also if they didn't follow his commandments. So, after that lovely note of the punishments that would befall them for disobeying, then we get to chapter 27 here. So here we go. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If anyone makes a special vow to dedicate someone to the Lord by paying the value of that person, here is the scale of values to be used. A man between the ages of 20 and 60 is valued at 50 shekels of silver, as measured by the sanctuary shekel. A woman of that age is valued at 30 shekels of silver. A boy between the ages of 5 and 20 is valued at 20 shekels of silver. A girl of that age is valued at 10 shekels of silver. A boy between the ages of 1 month and 5 years is valued at 5 shekels of silver. A girl of that age is valued at 3 shekels of silver. A man older than 60 is valued at 15 shekels of silver. A woman of that age is valued at 10 shekels of silver. If you desire to make such a vow but cannot afford to pay the required amount, take the person to the priest. He will determine the amount for you to pay based on what you can afford." So, special vow to dedicate someone to the Lord. I'm not entirely sure what that means. The only instance of that comes to mind is there was, at a later spot in the Bible, but there was a particular woman who kind of in a way made a deal with God, you could say. That, if she had a son, she would dedicate him to service in the temple or the tabernacle or whatever it might have technically been at the time. But I would assume dedicating someone to the Lord, I almost have to think that's going to be, related to, like, serving the priests or something to that effect. But, I don't know for sure. That's just the only thing that really makes sense to me. Because what else would be meant by dedicating someone to the Lord? Anyway, footnotes. Okay, just giving alternate measurements for the weights of silver. So 50 shekels would have been about 20 ounces or 570 grams. And all these other ones are just kind of, offshoots of that. As to why male would have been more valuable than female, I think that just kind of comes down to the general recognition of the fact that, men were generally more physically capable to help with whatever various tasks might have needed assistance. Which, again, would make all the more sense for, dedicating to the Lord, meaning essentially, setting someone aside as a helper to the priests. But anyway, again, not 100% sure on that. So anyway, then we get to verse 9. If your vow involves giving an animal that is acceptable as an offering to the Lord, any gift to the Lord will be considered holy. You may not exchange or substitute it for another animal, neither a good animal for a bad one, nor a bad animal for a good one. But if you do exchange one animal for another, then both the original animal and its substitute will be considered holy. If your vow involves an unclean animal, one that is not acceptable as an offering to the Lord, then you must bring the animal to the priest. He will assess its value, and his assessment will be final, whether high or low. If you want to buy back the animal, you must pay the value set by the priest, plus 20%. If someone dedicates a house to the Lord, the priest will come to assess its value. The priest's assessment will be final, whether high or low. If the person who dedicated the house wants to buy it back, he must pay the value set by the priest plus 20%. Then the house will again be his. Okay, so still not entirely made clear what the whole dedicating thing means, but still, probably similar idea, I'm guessing, that these things are being dedicated for use by the priests for God's purposes. Whatever was going to be given wasn't supposed to be substituted either, going by, verses 9 and 10. But that was for an animal that's an acceptable offering, as opposed to an unclean animal. In terms of, since you can't really buy people back, or at least I wouldn't think you would if you were going to dedicate them. But anyway, buyback prices were all plus 20% because, you had to give the priest back kind of the extra value that they're now losing out on from selling the animal back to you, I guess. Similar with the house. Again, that's kind of my own thought process, not saying that's 100% sure, like absolute truth related to that. Then, verse 16. If someone dedicates to the Lord a piece of his family property, its value will be assessed according to the amount of seed required to plant it. 50 shekels of silver for a field planted with 5 bushels of barley seed. If the field is dedicated to the Lord in the year of Jubilee, then the entire assessment will apply. But if the field is dedicated after the year of Jubilee, the priest will assess the land's value in proportion to the number of years left until the next year of Jubilee. Its assessed value is reduced each year. If the person who dedicated the field wants to buy it back, he must pay the value set by the priest plus 20%. Then the field will again be legally his. But if he does not want to buy it back, and it is sold to someone else, the field can no longer be bought back. When the field is released in the year of Jubilee, it will be holy, a field specially set apart for the Lord. It will become the property of the priests. So there's an interesting little, I don't want to say loophole because that has kind of a negative connotation, but an interesting situation where the year of Jubilee doesn't necessarily give land back to its original owner. But, if you were going to dedicate a portion of your land for something like this, I wouldn't think you'd be getting rid of land that you absolutely needed anyway. So, yeah. Because if that were a thing that generally happened, it would make more sense for the land to go back to the original owner and not stay property of the priests. But that would also require, the priest having to sell it to someone else. Because up until the land is, sold to a different person after the priest has it, then the original owner can buy it back at the increased value. Footnote there at specially set apart. Hebrew term used here refers to the complete consecration of things or people to the Lord, either by destroying them or by giving them as an offering. Okay. But all that to say, yeah, it's set aside specifically as, like, God's possession, essentially. So it's no longer tied to the original owner who decided to dedicate it to the Lord. It is now straight up God's property. Verse 22. If someone dedicates to the Lord a field he has purchased, but which is not part of his family property, the priest will assess its value based on the number of years left until the next year of Jubilee. On that day, he must give the assessed value of the land as a sacred donation to the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, the field must be returned to the person from whom he purchased it, the one who inherited it as a family property. All the payments must be measured by the weight of the sanctuary shekel, which equals 20 gerahs. You may not dedicate a firstborn animal to the Lord, for the firstborn of your cattle, sheep, and goats already belong to him. However, you may buy back the firstborn of a ceremonially unclean animal by paying the priest's assessment of its worth plus 20%. If you do not buy it back, the priest will sell it at its assessed value. So, if someone is, like, dedicating land that was bought from somebody else, then that does get returned to the original owner at the year of Jubilee. Because, that might have been purchased from the original owner because, they were financially struggling or whatever and might have kind of had to sell it. Which is the whole point of the Jubilee is, returning things that, were lost out of a sense of necessity. And as for the thing about the unclean animal, my only thought was, the priest selling it off at its assessed value, similar to what we talked about with the property, is like, because if a priest sells it off to somebody else, it can't go back to its original owner. Plus, in the case of an animal, I mean, it's probably not necessarily that significant of a thing. Plus, the firstborn was already supposed to be dedicated to the Lord anyway. That was something that pretty much automatically happened. Basically, everything else that it's talking about in this chapter would have been additional situations on top of that. But, okay. So then we get to verse 28. And I think I might just go through the end of the chapter then. However, anything specially set apart for the Lord, whether a person, an animal, or family property, must never be sold or bought back. Anything devoted in this way has been set apart as holy, and it belongs to the Lord. No person specially set apart for destruction may be bought back. Such a person must be put to death. 1/10 of the produce of the land, whether grain from the fields or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord and must be set apart to him as holy. If you want to buy back the Lord's 10th of the grain or fruit, you must pay its value plus 20%. Count off every 10th animal from your herds and flocks, and set them apart for the Lord as holy. You may not pick and choose between good and bad animals, and you may not substitute one for another. But if you do exchange one animal for another, then both the original animal and its substitute will be considered holy and cannot be bought back. These are the commands the Lord gave through Moses on Mount Sinai for the Israelites. Okay, so hold up. I'm trying to understand, especially the situation in verse 28 here. Anything specially set apart for the Lord must never be sold or bought back. But weren't we just describing situations of them being sold or bought back? That kind of doesn't really make any sense. Let's see here. So it talked about... Which ones did it talk about buying back? Not people. An unclean animal could be bought back. Not necessarily one that's an acceptable offering. House could be bought back. Piece of land could be bought back. But, yeah. I mean, okay, so the person obviously was already excluded from that. Animal, especially when clean and acceptable as an offering, okay, it didn't really specifically mention buying that back. But the family property, it mentioned about that possibly being bought back. Although, I mean, it says a field, like a piece of the property. Perhaps this is talking about, like, if it was the entirety of a family property. I don't know. Anyway. But I think the point was that, you know, things that were dedicated to the Lord, it's like, okay, you're willingly giving this up. So it's God's now, not yours. But and then down here talking about, you know, the grain and such. I think, you know, similar to giving the firstborn animal to the Lord, they were supposed to do a similar kind of thing with, like, the first harvest. I mean, it says 1/10 of the produce of the land. That's the origin of what we nowadays consider to be, you know, the tithe. You know, giving 10% of your earnings to God, whether it be to the local church or to, you know, other similar efforts. Generally to, you know, the church that you attend, though. But in this case, because it was, you know, other physical things being given that may have been useful for, especially food in this case, If somebody really wanted it back that badly, they could buy it at 120% of its value. So then, the priests and, their tasks, their operations, their service to God would still have, some sort of support and funding. Because then they could use that value, that money that was used to buy back that stuff, and probably go and get more things. Also, every 10th animal, so similar to a 10th the produce, was supposed to be set apart for the Lord. But anyway, and that officially wraps things up for Leviticus. Okay, so to wrap up Leviticus, we get a chapter pretty much all about just a way to, dedicate things to the Lord. At least that was, described for the Israelites to do. And at least for some of those things, a way to potentially, get them back if they had need for it again later. But there were also some ways where things that were dedicated could not be, regained. So, anyway, that's really all there was. Seems a bit random, but, if you're dedicating something to God, that's kind of what, in a sense, the book of Leviticus has been all about, is, the people dedicating themselves to God through following various commands, and God laying out how to make that happen. But anyway, so that does it for now. As always, like and share if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description to get info on other social media pages, and leave comments below that with any thoughts you have. So that does it for this one. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next video. Definitely for the next, Bible study video, where we'll be starting the book of Numbers. But whatever the case is, till next time, stay cool, people.